Here's a scene a lot of people are living through right now, in early June. You walk out to a hydrangea you've babied for a couple of years. The leaves are big, deep green, glossy. The plant looks healthy, and there isn't a single flower on it. No buds swelling, no color, nothing. Just a handsome green bush sitting where you expected a cloud of blooms. If that's your hydrangea, I want to take one thing off your shoulders before we go any further. A hydrangea with great leaves and no flowers is almost never sick, and you almost certainly didn't kill it. What actually happened is simpler. Something quietly removed this year's flowers, while the leaves carried on like nothing was wrong. There are only a handful of things that do that. Pruning at the wrong time, a hard winter or a late frost, the wrong amount of light, too much nitrogen, and a plant that's quietly stressed. We're going to walk through all 5 in plain language so you can figure out which one is happening in your yard. But the first step is a question most people never stop to ask, and it changes the answer to everything else. What kind of hydrangea are you actually looking at? Here's why a hydrangea can look so healthy and still refuse to flower. It makes 2 different kinds of buds. Leaf buds, which open into all that green growth, and flower buds, which open into blooms. The flower buds are more fragile, and they're made and stored on a different schedule depending on the type of plant. So it's completely possible to lose every flower bud to cold or to a bad pruning cut, while the tougher leaf buds sail through untouched. The plant leafs out, looks vigorous, and gives you nothing on top. Extension offices hear this exact complaint constantly: a living, lush plant with no flowers. So before you change anything, identify your hydrangea. It sounds basic. It's the single most useful thing you can do, because hydrangeas split into 2 camps that need almost opposite care, and advice for one camp can ruin the other. The first camp blooms on what gardeners call old wood. That means the plant sets next year's flower buds in late summer on the same stems that just finished blooming, and then carries those buds on bare canes all through fall and winter. If anything happens to those canes before the next summer, the flowers are gone. The old wood group is the one most people picture first. Bigleaf hydrangeas, the classic mophead and lacecap types with big rounded leaves and pink or blue flowers. Mountain hydrangeas, which look like smaller, daintier bigleafs. Oakleaf hydrangeas, with leaves shaped like an oak's and cone-shaped white blooms that age to pink. And climbing hydrangeas, the vining kind. The second camp blooms on new wood. These build their flower buds fresh, on the current year's growth, every spring after they leaf out, and they bloom in mid to late summer. Because they start over each year, they usually bloom more reliably after a hard winter than the old wood types. There are 2 main ones, and both tend to have white flowers. Panicle hydrangeas, with cone or football-shaped clusters, often grown almost like a small tree, and the toughest of the bunch in cold climates. And smooth hydrangeas, the big, round, white snowballs, the most famous being the variety called Annabelle. Keep your type in the back of your mind, because almost everything that follows lands differently on the old wood group than on the new wood group. And the first reason for a bloomless hydrangea is also the most common one extension offices report. So let's start there. Mistake number 1 is pruning at the wrong time. The University of Maryland Extension puts this plainly. It calls wrong time pruning the number 1 reason hydrangeas don't flower. And it almost always happens to the old wood group. Remember what old wood means. A bigleaf, mountain, oakleaf, or climbing hydrangea makes next summer's flower buds in late summer and early fall. And then those buds ride out the whole winter sitting on the stems. So picture what happens when someone walks out in October, sees a tired shrub with brown flower heads, and decides to tidy it up by cutting it back. Or someone sees brown, dead-looking canes in March and trims them off. Or a well-meaning relative takes the shears to the whole thing in November because it looked messy. In every one of those cases, the flower buds for the coming summer were sitting right there on the wood that got removed. The plant will leaf out fine in spring. It'll look healthy. It just has no flowers left to give because they went out with the clippings. This is the heartbreaker, because the effort was real and the plant looks great. If you have an old wood hydrangea that's gone years without blooming and you've been pruning it, that timing is very likely your answer. So here's the rule for the old wood group. If you prune at all, do it right after it finishes flowering in summer, within a few weeks of the blooms fading, and then leave it alone. After that window, the plant is already building next year's buds, and you don't want to touch it. Honestly, most of these plants barely need pruning. You can take out dead or crossing canes and clip spent flower heads, and otherwise let it be. One more thing that trips people up. In spring, old wood canes can look dead before they leaf out, and people cut them off too soon. Before you cut, do the scratch test. Scrape a little bark with your thumbnail. Green underneath means the cane is alive and may still carry buds. Brown and dry all the way through means it's truly dead and safe to remove. When in doubt, wait. You can always cut later. You can't uncut a flower bud. Now, the new wood group is the opposite story, and this is where knowing your type pays off. Panicle and smooth hydrangeas make their buds fresh in spring, so you prune them in late winter or early spring, before new growth starts, and they bloom that same summer with no problem. You can even cut them back hard. Pruning these in spring doesn't cost you a single flower. So the same March haircut that wrecks a big leaf is perfectly fine on a panicle. And if you have one of the newer reblooming big leaf types, the endless summer kind, those have been bred to flower on both old and new wood, which gives you a second chance if the old wood buds are lost. They're more forgiving, but you still want to protect that old wood, for reasons that lead straight into the next mistake. Because pruning isn't the only thing that can quietly strip the flower buds off an old wood plant. The weather can do the exact same thing, and when it does, it's genuinely not your fault. Mistake number 2 is letting winter or a late frost take the buds, and this one mostly hits the old wood group in colder areas. Think again about those flower buds sitting on bare canes all winter. They're exposed. A long, hard winter, or worse, a stretch of warm weather in late winter that wakes the plant up, followed by a sudden hard freeze, can kill those flower buds outright. And here's the cruel part that explains so many confused homeowners. Cold often kills the flower buds while the leaf buds survive. The extension answer to this exact question is almost word for word what you're seeing. A living plant with lush foliage and no flowers. The plant leaves out, looks completely healthy, and simply has nothing left to bloom with because the flowers froze months earlier while the plant was bare and you weren't even thinking about it. This is heavily a regional and a zone issue. Many big leaf hydrangeas become less reliable bloomers as you move into Zone 5 and colder, especially in exposed spots. The plant may survive and leaf out, but the flower buds can still be lost. The plant itself may be tough enough to survive and regrow, but the flower buds aren't as cold hardy as the rest of it. It's also why those florist hydrangeas you get around Easter, the ones forced into bloom in a warm greenhouse, so often go into the yard and never flower again. They were never bud hardy for an outdoor winter. Now connect that to where we are on the calendar. It's early June. If you have an old wood hydrangea that's leafed out beautifully, but you see no fat little flower buds forming anywhere, a freeze or a bad pruning cut probably took this year's flowers, and that's a wait till next year situation. But if you have a panicle or a smooth hydrangea, don't panic yet. Those bloom on new growth later in summer, so their show may still be coming. If cold is your enemy, you have real options. For old wood types in cold zones, the move is to protect the buds over winter. After the ground starts to freeze in late fall, Mound several inches of mulch or shredded leaves up over the base and crown of the plant, and leave it until the danger of frost has passed in spring. For plants in really exposed spots, you can build a simple cage of stakes and chicken wire around the plant and fill it loosely with dry leaves, or wrap the canes in burlap once it's dormant. Plant them somewhere sheltered to begin with, near a wall, a fence, or a row of evergreens that block the harsh winter wind. And if a late frost shows up in the spring forecast when the plant is already waking up, throw an old sheet or blanket over it overnight. But if you're honest with yourself and you fight this battle every single year, the simplest fix is to stop fighting it. Plant the new wood types. Panicle and smooth hydrangeas build their buds fresh each spring, so winter bud loss is usually not the problem the way it is with old wood types. They're why some yards in cold climates are covered in blooms, while the bigleaf next door sits there green and empty. A reblooming bigleaf is a middle ground, but for sheer reliability in the cold, panicle and smooth win. Between bad pruning and bad winters, you've probably explained a lot of empty old wood shrubs. But plenty of hydrangeas never get pruned wrong and never get frozen, and they still won't flower. When that happens, the next place to look is usually where the plant is standing. Mistake number 3 is the wrong amount of light, and there are 2 versions of it that go in opposite directions. You've probably heard hydrangeas called shade plants. That's half true, and it gets a lot of plants in trouble. Most hydrangeas want some shade, but they're not full shade plants, and flowering is the first thing they give up when they're too dark. Start with the old wood group again, the bigleaf and mountain types. Their sweet spot is morning sun with afternoon shade. They need a good dose of light to build the energy to set flower buds in the first place. A bigleaf can manage on as little as about 3 hours of direct sun, but planted in deep, full shade, it does something very specific. It grows lush, healthy, dark green leaves and barely flowers because it's spending what little light it gets on foliage. So a hydrangea tucked against a shady north wall or buried under heavy tree canopy can look perfectly green and never bloom. And this can sneak up on you. A spot that was sunny when you planted 10 years ago can be deep shade now that the maple above it has filled in. The flip side matters just as much, and it depends on where you live. In the hot South, places like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, the Carolinas, Texas, and Louisiana, harsh afternoon sun is brutal on bigleaf and mountain hydrangeas. Those big, thin leaves can't move water fast enough to keep up, so they scorch and wilt, and the blooms collapse, sometimes right after a watering. In the South, that afternoon shade isn't optional. In cooler northern areas, the same plant can take more sun without complaint. Now here's the part that surprises people, and it's exactly backward from the shade plant reputation. Panicle hydrangeas, the cone-flowered ones, want more sun than almost anyone gives them. Stuck in shade, a panicle gets leggy, floppy, and stingy with flowers. They generally want close to a half day of direct sun or more. Varieties like Limelight and Bobo bloom best with something like 5 hours of direct light, sometimes more. If your panicle isn't flowering, shade is one of the first things to suspect. Smooth hydrangeas, the Annabelle types, sit in the middle. They like bright shade or morning sun and want protection from the worst afternoon heat. So the fix is to match the type to the light it actually wants, and to go look at where the sun really falls. Stand in the yard at 8 in the morning and again at 3 in the afternoon, and see what that spot is getting. If an old wood hydrangea is drowning in shade, you can move it in early spring, or thin a few branches overhead to let morning light back in. If a panicle is hidden in the shade, it wants out. If this is already helping you make sense of your own plant, that's exactly what this channel is for. So, if you want more of it, subscribe. Light gives the plant enough fuel to even consider flowering. The next mistake is almost the opposite problem. It's what happens when the plant has plenty of fuel and pours all of it into leaves on purpose. It's the most literal version of leaves instead of blooms. Mistake number 4 is too much nitrogen. And this is the one that produces a textbook leafy, flowerless hydrangea. Nitrogen is the first number on a bag of fertilizer, and its job is to drive leafy, green, stem and foliage growth. A hydrangea needs some, but give it too much and the plant does exactly what you'd expect. It builds a big, lush, beautiful green bush and skips the flowers, because all that energy is going into leaves instead of flower buds. Extension specialists describe it the same way over and over. Clemson's experts say over-fertilized hydrangeas tend to be big and leafy with almost no flowers. The University of Maryland lists excess nitrogen as a real cause of reduced blooming. If your hydrangea looks like it's winning a contest for healthiest foliage in the neighborhood and still won't bloom, nitrogen is the first thing to check. Here's the sneaky version of this one. You might not be fertilizing the hydrangea at all and still be overdosing it. Lawn fertilizer is usually loaded with nitrogen, and if your hydrangea sits at the edge of a lawn you feed, that nitrogen washes and drifts right into its root zone. UMass Extension specifically warns about lawn fertilizer reaching nearby plants. So the culprit might be the weed and feed you put on the grass, not anything you did to the shrub. The fix is gentle. Go easy on feeding. If you fertilize at all, use a balanced, slow-release fertilizer in early spring. Follow the label, and do not assume more fertilizer means more flowers. If the plant looks weak or your soil has not been tested in years, a basic soil test through your county extension office is smarter than guessing. Keep high nitrogen lawn fertilizer away from the hydrangea bed, and don't broadcast it right up to the base of the shrub. One more timing note that connects back to winter. Stop feeding by midsummer, because late feeding can push soft new growth that won't harden well before frost. And if your hydrangea is brand new, planted in the last year or so, give it a little grace. A young hydrangea often spends its first season building roots and may bloom lightly or skip a year while it settles in. That's normal, and the answer is patience, not more fertilizer. That covers the plant that eats too well. The last mistake is about the plant that's quietly struggling, because a stressed hydrangea treats flowers as the first thing it can afford to skip. Mistake number 5 is quiet stress, and it usually comes from how the plant is watered and how it was planted. A plant under stress has one priority, and that's to stay alive. Flowering is a luxury, and it's the first thing a struggling plant drops. Flower buds take a surplus of stored energy to build, and a hydrangea that's fighting just to keep its leaves from wilting doesn't have a surplus to spare. Watering is where this goes wrong most often, and it goes wrong in both directions. The most common mistake is a light sprinkle every day. It feels caring, but it only wets the top inch or two of soil. The roots stay shallow, chasing that surface water, and the plant swings between soggy mornings and bone-dry afternoons. Both extremes cost flowers. Repeated drought stress will keep a plant from blooming even when the leaves still look okay. And waterlogged roots that can't breathe will do the same thing while faking the look of a thirsty plant. The name hydrangea even comes from the Greek word for water, so these plants do want steady moisture. They just want it the right way. The right way is deep and less often. Give the plant a long, slow soak once or twice a week so the water reaches down where the real roots are, rather than a quick splash every day. Lean toward more water and heat in sandy soil and in the hot southern zones, and less in cool weather or heavy clay that already holds water. Lay down 2 or 3 inches of mulch over the root zone, kept back off the stem, to hold that moisture in and steady the soil temperature. Water the soil, not the leaves, And do it in the morning so any splash dries off, which keeps leaf spot fungus down. And before you water at all, push a finger or a wooden dowel a couple of inches into the soil. If it's still moist down there, wait. Then there's how it went into the ground. 2 planting mistakes quietly hold a hydrangea back for years. The first is planting too deep. The crown, where the stems meet the roots, should sit right at the soil surface, not buried below it. Bury that crown and it stays wet. The roots struggle and the whole plant limps along. The second is ignoring pot-bound roots. A hydrangea that spent a long time in a nursery pot has roots circling the inside of that container. If you drop that root ball straight into the ground, the roots just keep circling instead of spreading out, and the plant never really establishes. Before planting, loosen those outer roots with your fingers or score the root ball with a few shallow cuts down the sides so the roots head outward into the soil. If you grow hydrangeas in containers, give them a real chance. A pot big enough for the roots, real potting mix instead of dug-up yard soil, and drainage holes that actually drain. And remember that roots in a pot sit much more exposed to cold than roots in the ground, so an old wood type in a container may need a sheltered spot or winter protection to keep those buds alive. One more quiet flower thief worth a mention: deer. Hungry deer will nibble the tender flower buds right off the canes, including the overwinter buds on old wood plants. If you have deer pressure and a bush that leafs out but never blooms, that's worth ruling in or out. Before we wrap up, one thing always comes up with hydrangeas, so let me clear it up fast: flower color. 2 quick truths will save you a lot of wasted effort. First, color is a completely separate issue from whether the plant blooms at all. Pouring bluing chemicals on a bush that isn't flowering won't make it flower. Fix the bloom problem first. Second, only bigleaf and mountain hydrangeas change color with soil chemistry, where acidic soil pushes them blue and alkaline soil pushes them pink. The white flowering types, panicle, smooth, oakleaf, and climbing, don't change with soil pH. An Annabelle stays white, and a limelight stays white to green no matter what you add to the soil, so don't waste money trying. If you do have a big leaf or a mountain and you want to shift the color, start with a cheap soil test and move the pH slowly. Dumping chemicals in blind is a good way to stress the plant, and a stressed plant, as we just covered, gives you fewer flowers, not more. So here's your simple path out of the green but flowerless problem. Before you change anything, identify your hydrangea. Old wood is bigleaf, mountain, oakleaf, and climbing. New wood is panicle and smooth. Then run down the short list. Was it pruned or cut back outside its safe window? Did a hard winter or a late frost hit an old wood plant? Is it sitting in too much shade, or, if it's a panicle, not enough sun? Is it getting hammered with nitrogen, including runoff from the lawn? Is it stressed by shallow watering, deep planting, or cramped roots? Almost every time, the answer is 1 or 2 items on that list, not some mystery. And take the pressure off. A leafy hydrangea with no flowers is rarely a lost plant. If yours is a new wood type, the flowers may still be on their way this summer. If it's an old wood type that lost this year's buds, you protect next year starting now, with the right pruning timing and a little winter cover. I won't promise that every plant can be turned around this same season, because some years a freeze simply takes the show, and there's nothing to do but wait. That isn't a failure on your part, it's weather. I'd like to know what you're working with. Tell me in the comments which type you're growing and your zone. And if you've ever cut yours back in fall or early spring, say so, because that one habit is the most common bloom thief on this whole list. And naming it out loud helps the next person reading the comments who's about to make the same cut. And if you'd rather understand why a plant does what it does than guess at it every spring, subscribe. The whole idea here is to send you out to the yard knowing what to look for, instead of standing in front of a green bush wondering what you did wrong. You didn't do anything wrong. You just needed to know which hydrangea you had. Now you do.